Hi, I'm Chef Kirk here today for Ardent Mills, the premier flour milling and ingredient company for nutritious and innovative grain-based solutions. Today, we're going to be talking you through some troubleshooting steps for your bread dough. Now, we're making a country loaf, and today we're going to be using our Ardent Mills King Midas Special Flour. It's really high in protein. It's going to let us develop a lot of good structure through that loaf. First thing into our mixer is always our water. Next thing into our mixer is going to be our yeast. We're going to take a minute here just to talk a little bit about food safety. It's very important to remember that flour is a raw ingredient. Make sure that we're not tasting anything until our final product is finished and it's been baked through to a safe temperature. Next into our mix is going to be our flour. Now, the reason our salt goes in last is so it doesn't kill that yeast for us. Before we move on to scaling out our dough balls, what we want to do now is a window pane test. We're going to cut out a small piece of our dough, stretch that dough slowly out between our fingers, getting it thinner and thinner, and what we're looking for is actually a window pane in the dough. We're going to have a very thin, translucent piece of dough in between our fingers that hasn't ripped. You can almost see through it. We're going to go ahead and we're going to scale out our dough balls and get them ready for the first initial rise. And so what we want for our initial rise is we want a nice tight skin over the whole dough ball. So we're just going to fold everything into the center of the ball, pulling everything underneath. And we're going to gently roll the ball between our two hands. And when we flip that dough ball over, we see we've got a nice tight seam on the bottom. And we want to reshape that ball again so that we get that nice tight skin on the top. The reason we do this is the longer dough takes to rise, the more flavor it develops. We're back after our second fermentation, and I brought one of our dough balls back just to show you how that we're going to check that dough to make sure that it's ready to go into the oven. So what we want to do now is we want to lightly press on the dough, and what we're looking for is a little bit of spring back from where we've pressed, and that we have a little bit of a dimple left after it does come back. If we were to push this in and it was not to come back at all, or the dough ball would collapse, that means our dough is overproofed. If we push on it and it comes all the way back and it doesn't leave an indentation, that means that we're still underproofed and it still needs to go a little bit more. And what we want to do now is slash it to give us a controlled point for that yeast to push on. One quick slash through the center of our bread. We do want to make that slash fairly deep. Now our dough has been slashed and it's ready to go into the oven. So we've just pulled our wonderful loaf out of the oven, and now I'm going to go through a couple of the characteristics that show me that this loaf is fully risen and has turned out great. So the first thing we notice right off the bat, that slash that we made in the top has opened up nicely. That lets us know that our final oven spring has done its job and that yeast has worked to its maximum. Also, in regards to the yeast, we notice that along the bottom, we don't have any splitting anywhere on the loaf. We've got a nice hard crust that's nice and glossy, nice little micro bubbles in the top there. This is a really good looking loaf. Now I'm going to bring out a second loaf that I've done ahead of time, where I've made a few missteps along the way. So the first thing that we notice with this loaf that hasn't turned out quite right is the difference in the slashing on the top. You can see this one's opened up nicely, this one hasn't. You can also notice that the crust is very dull. It doesn't have the nice micro blisters along on top as well. And then one final thing that we notice is our outside inspection. When we lift that up, we can see right along the bottom, our seam is really split open here. And what that shows us is that yeast wasn't allowed enough time to work and do its final rise, and it also hasn't been slashed deeply enough, and that yeast has looked for somewhere else to push those gases out of that bread. Now we're going to cut these two loaves open and we're going to have a look at the interior of both of them and show you a couple differences between the two loaves. So the first thing that we notice is that on this side, our good loaf, we have a nice even crumb structure through there. We've got nice little holes, nice tender crumb. And on this side, we notice that the grain structure is very tight. For any more application tips, flour or grain recommendations, please feel free to visit our website.